If you exist, high chances are you've watched a TV show, which by extension, you've probably watched an intro to a TV show. Whether that be a quick and simple little title card present in most Western shows, or a full 1 minute plus intro featured in most anime. But have you ever taken the time to pause the intro and analyze each meticulous frame one by one to find all the little details, Easter eggs, and maybe even a hint of foreshadowing? No? Well then good news, because that's what we're doing today. Breaking down the very first Delicious in Dungeon opening to consume all the delectable hidden details carefully homegrown by the animators. Spoilers for the entirety of the Delicious in Dungeon manga, by the way. The very first cut begins with our adventurers strolling through a dark hallway illuminated by Marcille's light bulb magic, which is pretty similar to this scene from episode 1, when the party moves on to the second floor of the dungeon, but from a low angle, as well as the party walking side by side instead of Senshi leading the party forward. As the lyrics kick in, we're shown a montage of each core party member, plus Falin, Shuro, Namari, and Kabru, with their eyes closed, standing in some very character-specific areas, both inside and outside the dungeon. Guess you could call them the sleepwalking orchestra, eh? I'll see myself out for that one. We start with the main man himself, Laios, holding a winged lionless Kensuke on the 3rd floor, although with the back walls missing to add some visual flair to the opening, plus a party of 4 in the background traversing the dungeon. However, this clear blue sky imagery may not just be for visual flair, as a clear sky can often represent immortality, the dungeon's defining feature which attracts oh so many adventurers to seek out the Mad Mage for themselves, in hopes of learning his dark ancient secrets, as established in the very first scene of episode 1. Or maybe I'm looking into this too much. You decide in the comments. The significance of Laios holding Kensuke specifically on the 3rd floor could also be a nod to episode 5, in which we see Kensuke alert Laios to the presence of monsters for the very first time. We move to Marcille standing in the ocean, with ships departing from the island in which the dungeon is located. In fact, this is one of our very few glimpses of the island outside of the dungeon. While not all of the locations present in the opening are specifically tied to the characters shown, as we'll get into later, Marcille being tied to boats departing from the island could be a nod to chapter 57, in which she arrives on the island for the first time by boat. But I feel like I'm looking into this one a little too much, as the boats departing could simply be for world building or visual flair. We move back into the dungeon with Falin standing on the 5th floor, ironically in the very spot the Red Dragon was slain, and the exact spot Falin got chimeraed by Thistle. Although in the opening, a clear blue sky replaces the cold dark ceiling of the dungeon as seen in the show. The lack of the dungeon ceiling is also most definitely not the Golden Country's original appearance atop the surface. The lack of the dungeon ceiling could also represent freedom, which would be ironic considering what happens to Falin. And if we zoom all the way in, it appears the party we saw with Laios on the 3rd floor has ventured deep enough into the dungeon to reach the 5th floor. We move up a floor where we find Chilchuck, well, chilling, beside the 4th floor's very square tower where the lake has blended together with the sky. Once again, we have a tiny party exploring the dungeon, although by the looks of it, this appears to be a different set of adventurers. There also doesn't seem to be any significance of Chilchuck being present on the 4th floor, as he doesn't really have any character-defining moments during this specific part of the story, unless you count his opposition to eating humanoid monsters, which you could consider character development to some degree. We jump 2 floors higher to find Senshi amongst the titanic overgrown trees of the 2nd floor, with a party trying to harvest a mandrake on one of the gigantic tree branches. They're also doing it the dog way, which is unfortunate. The nearby stone round tower could also be the same one in which the party encounters the basilisk in episode 2. It's got a very similar layout. Senshi being specifically on the 2nd floor is fairly fitting for both his circle of life speech on this very floor, and his overall appreciation for the sparse nature around him within the dungeon, which he's obviously grown accustomed to after a decade. The abundance of foliage could also have a deeper meaning relating to the overarching theme of peacefulness and stillness in the opening, which nature symbolizes. As a stark contrast, we cut to Shuro standing in an icy mountain pass, ready to whip out his katana. Judging by context clues from Izutsumi's flashback in episode 20, this icy mountain range seems to be located in the eastern region, in which Shuro originates from, based on the extremely thick snowfall, which again we saw in Izutsumi's flashback, making this one of our extremely rare peaks of the eastern region. Although according to Laios in the manga, the northern region is very icy and mountainous, so I don't know. I mean, it'd be weird to put Shuro in the northern region, but it's a 50-50. Typically, snowstorms like the one here in the opening tend to symbolize change or violent emotions, which is of course very fitting due to Shuro's admittedly provoked quarrel with Laios in episode 17, and his overall change of demeanor towards Laios at the end of the story, going from very distant and secretly viewing Laios as more of a burden to be around, to becoming more trusting in Laios' ability to handle intense situations, as well as just be friendlier to the guy in general towards the very end of the manga. Judging by the color scheme of these party members, it appears that the party from the 3rd floor at the beginning of the opening, somehow manage to end up in the eastern region as their journey continues. If we want to do a bit of stretching, I guess you could also say the hazardous snowy environment present here in the opening would be a slight foreshadowing of the Frozen Over 6th floor. Probably not though. We move back into the dungeon with Namari on the first floor, which looks oddly smaller here than usual, and not because it's practically empty, aside from our group of unnamed adventurers, we finally have a somewhat close-up of. Having Namari on the first floor doesn't seem to have any reasoning behind it, unless it's supposed to be a nod to her appearing on the first floor when escorting the Canaries alongside Kabru and Shuro in chapter 53, or when all the side characters rally together in chapter 78. But I feel like that's looking into things way too much, considering how late in the story both of these events occur. We move outside the dungeon one last time, with Kabru standing in presumably his hometown of Utaya, judging by the terrain we see here in the opening and during Kabru's flashback in episode 21. Although this time the dark gloomy sky has been replaced by a brighter clear blue sky, setting a more hopeful tone in the opening as our tiny adventurers make their final appearance, quite literally looking up to Kabru. However, this feeling of hope is merely a fleeting moment, as Falin sits alone in an empty black void, with the only light being illuminated by herself. This dark void is most definitely a stand-in for Falin slowly being digested alone in the Red Dragon's stomach, while the other parties try their best to make it back to the 6th floor before time runs out. The close-up of Falin further accentuates her feelings of hopelessness in the dragon's stomach. She slowly raises her head, transitioning into another close-up, this time of her face, where we do more stretching, as Falin's sad head raise is very reminiscent of episode 17, in which she very briefly pleads with Laios after getting thunderstruck by Vryn. The dark void is immediately contrasted by a green sky and almost angelic lighting, as the plot-relevant female and male characters in the first half of season 1 reach out to the heavens above. Going by characters in order, we have Daya, Mrs. Tansu, Kiki, Fional, Rin, Lead, as well as both Namari and Marcille at either side of Falin, who reaches the farthest toward the majestic light above. If I was to give a shot in the dark, it appears each character is placed by how close they are to Falin, with obvious characters like Daya, Mrs. Tansu, Kiki, and Fional being the farthest from Falin, as they don't really interact until the very end of the manga. It would also explain the noticeable gap between them and Rin, as she was the only one to leave a significant mark on Chimera Falin during the party's initial encounter of her monstrous transformation. Lead being so high up could also be explained by the implications of Lead marrying Laios after he becomes king of the Golden Country, as she never even sees Chimera Falin, let alone regular human Falin, until again, the very end of the manga. Of course, Namari and Marcille are the closest to Falin due to their close bond from exploring the dungeon, or in the case of Marcille, they've been close friends for over a decade. Referring back to the sort of angelic lighting, this is most definitely symbolism for not only her passing the Red Dragon's stomach, but her sort of limbo state as a chimera, where her consciousness seemingly briefly breaks through the dragon's usual hostile nature. Meanwhile, the male cast reaches downwards towards Falin and the others, which if we flip this section around, we can actually properly see who's here. Starting from the bottom left, with Holm, Kuro, Donnie, Zahn, Mikabel, Kaka, still can't get over that name by the way. They literally named this man doo-doo. Anyway, back on track with Mr. Tanzu, Kabru, Shuro, as well as both Senshi and Chilchuck at either side of Laios front and center, who mirrors Falin by reaching towards the light. Again, the characters could be ordered by how close they are to Laios, which would make sense as Senshi and Chilchuck are right next to Laios, while other characters like Donnie and Mikabel are at the very bottom due to their extremely minimal interactions with Laios. Tragically, we're given a close-up of Falin and Laios reaching out to each other, with the scene cutting right before their hands touch, obviously being a stand-in for Falin always being out of reach from the party, and the attempt to save her from the Red Dragon, and when she escapes after the initial Chimera encounter. After the two Tudens fail to meet, we're presented with two groups of characters roaming the halls of the dungeon, obviously being Shuro's party and the Golden Country's royal family. Starting with Maizaru, presumably trailing in Shuro's footsteps, followed by Benichidori, Yen, Tade, and Asabi, with a tale obviously foreshadowing her true identity as Izutsume. Definitely a blink and you'll miss it type moment. In the opposite direction, the Golden Country's royal family makes their way through the dungeon, starting with Yad, followed by Odio, with Thistle rushing into frame to catch up with Delgull and Freenag, and a scene that's sort of reminiscent of the Golden Country's inhabitants entering the dungeon for the first time. Although with Freenag being present in the opening and Yad being so old, as well as Thistle wearing a very different outfit, I doubt it's supposed to be a recreation of chapter 68. Staying on the topic of elves, the Canaries make their very early appearance in the season, en route to the island on board their ship, facing away from the camera to heighten their mysterious identities so early on in the series. Starting with Mithrin in the foreground, distant from the other Dungeon Squad members, with Lycion, Sithis, Paphidol, as well as both Flecky and Ada hidden in the front. Before the scene cuts, the wind blows Mithran's hair to give us a very brief look at his cut ears. Of course, being an important part of his character that will be explained in season 2. Again, another a blink and you'll miss it type moment, which is fairly rare for this opening. Which on the topic, we have a mysterious beast in a white void crawling towards the screen for a literal second. But if we take a closer look, it's actually the first appearance of the winged lion, and judging by the white void, this is most likely supposed to be taken from chapter 60, in which Laios meets the winged lion after getting sucked bone dry by the succubi. Which is honestly crazy to see this scene hinted at so early on in the series. Although considering the impact of said scene, it makes sense to very subtly hype it up. Although hear me out for this next one. The winged lion very briefly appearing before Laios falls into a seemingly bottomless ocean of blood could, and I really do want to stress, could be a nod to both Chimera Falin and Laios' own Chimera form in the final chapters of the manga, as obviously the winged lion is responsible for turning Laios and to a lesser extent Falin into a Chimera, but if I were to guess which Chimera this scene could be referencing, it's probably Falin due to the scene where the red dragon's blood sort of overtakes her body in episode 13, which would explain the overwhelming amount of blood here in this particular section of the opening. But what this part of the opening is definitely supposed to represent is Laios losing his leg after killing the red dragon in episode 11, so he falls in a very similar lifeless motion. As the camera rapidly gets closer to Laios, his face begins to scrunch up before opening his eyes, but as we enter his pupils, we can see the party feasting on grilled meat like in episode 8. As we're blinded by a white flash, the party relocates to the 5th floor, where they sit amidst the ruins of a building from the ancient Golden Country, trying down on bowls of rice maybe? Judging by the fact they're using chopsticks, and this unidentifiable white substance Chilchuck swallows. The camera quickly pans upwards through the dilapidated remnants of the once prosperous Golden Country, with a tile drop transitioning into a wide shot of the Golden Country, with a noticeably large monument to the winged lion in the background, bringing us to the end of the opening. An oddly melancholic yet bittersweet intro, which you would normally associate with an anime ending, but for Delicious in Dungeon Core 1, it's the other way around, with the opening being somewhat somber and melancholic, but the ending is cheery and uplifting. With that said though, Sleepwalking Orchestra is easily the best of the 2 season 1 openings. In fact, bold claim here, I highly doubt the season 2 openings will be able to surpass this peak opening. In all honesty though, I really wasn't expecting there to be this much to talk about. Like I genuinely didn't think I'd be able to get this video past 8 minutes, yet here we are. Appearances can be deceiving. Accidental fun life lessons with Delicious in Dungeon, I guess. Alright, I don't know how to smoothly end this video, so to live is to eat. See ya.